Why was this personal for you?
Well, yeah, so you and I go way back, and why abortion is so critical. That is certainly from a very personal experience. I grew up in South Dakota with family in both South Dakota and really conservative Christian communities in Northwest Iowa, these Dutch Calvinist communities. And at one point in the 80s, my mom and her sisters were going through a box of things from their parents' farm. Their parents had died years before. And they found a funeral card for this 14-year-old girl named Henrietta. And nobody knew who she was, but it was clear from the funeral card that she must have been my grandfather's older sister. And my mom's oldest sister, my aunt, was like, "Oh, maybe I do remember something about somebody saying that Pa had an older sister." Had no idea what had happened to this girl, right? Hadn't even realized that she had existed. And so that same aunt then went to some of the retirement homes in this tiny little community and talked to some of the women who would have been the same age as this great aunt of mine and asked if they knew what had happened to her. And they said essentially, oh yeah, something bad happened to her. And they
Mhm.
shut her up on the farm and she had that baby and then she died the next day and they placed that baby for adoption. And they were able, and I don't know the full story here, but to track down there was in fact a baby, and there was a larger town nearby where she was placed for adoption. They decided not to try to track that person down. She would have been in her late 50s. But essentially, this 14-year-old girl gave birth, and the official cause of death on her death certificate was kidney failure, but she had some sort of post partum complications and died. And it was either so shameful or so tragic or so, grievously sad or all of them together that they never talked about her again. Like nobody ever talked about her. And so, again, when I talk about making abortion safe and accessible, I have so much respect for so many of my colleagues who are really focused on legal rights. But I come everything from the bottom up, right? I love that people are looking at the vision, are looking at the top. But I always want to know about, right, the girls, the immigrant folks, folks who are poor, folks who are conservative communities. How can we try our very best to make sure that they have options? There is some choice for them to make if they find themselves in a situation where they're pregnant and they just can't be. And that orients my work in a slightly different way.
Cari Sietstra is an expert in new reproductive health and justice projects, and she is the director of the Period Pills Project. With a bachelor's from Harvard, where we met, and a JD from Stanford Law, she has dedicated the past 20 plus years to keeping girls and women safe. Cari first learned about menstrual regulation when she was working on the Myanmar-Thailand border. At the time, abortion was broadly criminalized in both countries, but if a person's period was late, it was easy to get access to pills that would start menstruation in just a few days. In Bangladesh, where abortion is largely illegal, menstrual regulation is available up to 10 weeks after you miss your period. Public health advocates routinely talk about it as a promising way to reduce maternal mortality and rates of unsafe abortion. Today on the podcast, we are talking about the spectrum of abortion rights in this country, the history of period management worldwide, and the many ways that women and those who love them can keep them safe in the case of an unwanted pregnancy, an unexpected miscarriage, and so much more. Because while legislators are scrutinizing precedent and religious scholars are quoting scripture, real life is still happening to girls and women worldwide. Carrie and I both come from families which, in their own ways, taught us the importance of taking a stand. And one thing is for sure, there is a lot more that we can do than just hope our votes count. Today, Carrie is helping us understand that. So Kamala made that beautiful speech of concession. And among other
Did
things, he said, I concede the election, but we do not concede the issues that we were fighting for. And one of
That's
the
right.
issues that most people were fighting for was women's rights over their bodies,
Mhm.
which is what triggered the idea to have a conversation with you. How do you characterize what you do and the place you occupy in the world of women's reproductive rights?
Sure. I think the easiest way that I explain it to, say, someone that I've met on a train, right, is that I work to make abortion safer and more accessible in places where it is legally restricted or banned. And that's been true for the past almost 20 years. I've worked in reproductive rights longer, almost 25 years, and I started in a much more legalistic framework in the US, working to change legal training and curriculum at law schools in the US and Canada. But what I've done since 2007, first internationally in a long-term conflict setting, and now in the United States, is to really focus on places where abortion is inaccessible or legally restricted, and to try to improve that and make it safer and more available to people who need it. When I talk to my sons, one of the ways I condense the reason for that is to say that, so far in human history, to the extent we know, there have been times when people become pregnant and they can't be pregnant. And then we have choices as a community and as a society, whether or not we want to make what happens next safe, right? Or, I think the fallback that folks always have is ending their own life as well as the pregnancy, right?
Mhm.
So that's what I do and why. So I've been back in the US working since 2019, 2018. Before that, I worked along the Thai-Myanmar border. So technically, abortion is illegal in Myanmar, but these are really extra legal settings that people are living in. And when I first started working in that region in 2007, unsafe abortion was one of the leading causes of maternal mortality, along with postpartum hemorrhage. And it turns out that the same medicine that we use all around the world for safe abortion is also this miracle drug for postpartum hemorrhage. So it's this double shot against maternal mortality in low resource areas. And so the work we did there really focused on training healthcare workers at all levels around using this medicine in both circumstances and to manage miscarriage, and then to making the medicine much more available in that region so that people have it on hand.
What is the medication that you're talking about that helps with postpartum hemorrhage?
The medicine that we're talking about is called misoprostol, and people pronounce it either misoprostol or misoprostol, and we shorten it to either miso or miso. It is a really inexpensive drug. It was first approved by the FDA in the 1980s to prevent gastric ulcers, which I think is fascinating.
Wow.
But essentially, um, an easy to make medication that would latch on to receptors in the uterus and make it cramp and expel its contents. Because so many different times when people are pregnant and the pregnancy is ending, whether it's abortion, miscarriage, or childbirth, you really need the uterus to expel what's inside of it and then clamp down so you don't have uncontrolled bleeding. And
Mhm.
this drug is incredibly good at that. It's also stable at room temperature and really cheap to make. It's like 2 cents a pill. So if there has been a miracle drug around maternal mortality the last 30 years, misoprostol is that drug.
So let's take a step back.
Sure.
You went to Harvard undergrad, you went to Stanford Law School. You did not choose the fancy car, corporate law lifestyle. Where did this come from for you?
So I knew I wanted to work in some way around women and girls empowerment. And when I graduated from law school, I did not feel equipped to address things like how to make the working economy work for women. Right? Like those weren't skills I had readily accessible. But I did graduate with a deep understanding of what abortion policy was in the United States. And the fact that we were really, this is, back in 2002, coming to a point where access to medications that could induce safe abortion were becoming more available, more widely known.
That's okay. More accessible and more widely known.
And that, in my mind, they really offered this incredible intervention that could shake up and change accessibility to abortion, both in the United States and in other countries. And in one way or the other, that's really where my career has focused ever since.
And it is personal. And when people talk about reproductive rights like it's a political issue, it becomes very difficult to break through. I think most of us have a personal story related to this. And mine, I don't think I've ever told you this, is my great aunt was in India before the partition of India and Pakistan and became a midwife. And this is at a time when a wife did not have to give consent for her body, and there was no such thing as birth control. That great aunt had a baby girl named Kiran, and Kiran died within a few days. And what she told me towards the end of her life was that she always kind of thought maybe Kiran died because of what she had done. And at one point, she tells me this story about a really, really, really poor woman
Yeah.
who had like 6 children already,
Mhm.
who came to her for help, visibly pregnant, beyond the point of pregnant where she would have ever normally performed a procedure. In her own mind, she wasn't comfortable with it. But this woman couldn't feed the children she already had.
Yeah.
Obviously, she had come asking for help without even telling her husband. She brought 3 children. And my great aunt said she did the procedure and she felt horrible about it, but she did it because she would have felt more horrible knowing what was going to happen to that woman and those children. And that for the rest of her life, she held on to that woman in her mind and that fetus in her mind. And she thought maybe that's why she had lost Kieran. So these things stay, right? And they're so much more complicated than people saying, well, God, life begins at conception. No, you know what? You don't know anybody's life until you've walked in their shoes, which is why I wanted to have this conversation because we can have a practical piece to it, right?
We can.
Tell
Yes.
me about the Period Pills Project.
So the project that I have been working on with most of my time the last 5 years in the United States really comes out of countries like India, right, and Bangladesh and Myanmar and Indonesia, where abortion was much less politicized, right, where everybody wanted to know how we fix the problem. Right. That was everybody's orientation. But one of the most fascinating pieces was that in the region where I worked, it wasn't simply birth control and abortion, right? There was this in between option of menstrual regulation, but essentially what it means is your period is late and you think, I might be pregnant. I can't be pregnant. I don't want to be pregnant. And that in many of these regions, right, there is something separate from abortion where you can take either herbs or increasingly pills like misoprostol, right, to bring down your period. You never do a pregnancy test. You simply make sure that you get your period back so you don't have to worry anymore. And at the end of the day, you're not pregnant. You may have had a very early abortion. You may have just brought on your menses. Either way, you get to this result where you can breathe again and you're not going to have a baby that you can't have.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came back to work in the US, right, 5 or 6 years ago, there were a number of us who had worked in other settings, particularly conservative settings, where this idea of bringing down your period, pushing your period, using menstrual regulation was much more culturally acceptable than abortion was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it embraces ambiguity. It's very early. There's often more tolerance for this gray area, both legally but also really culturally, than there might be for a clearly delineated abortion. We said, look, it's clear where the US is going, right? Like, unless we get really lucky in the next 5 to 10 years, abortion will either be practically illegal in a whole number of states, or it will be formally illegal. And obviously, after the Dobbs decision and Roe v. Wade being overturned, we're in a place where abortion is formally illegal in a number of states. So we asked, could it be possible in the United States to go back to this traditional, this old school, right, home kind of remedy that was very common in the United States all the way through the 19th century? You can do it at home. You can get pills from your doctor either in an office or through the mail, and you can bring on your late period, right, with the same pills we use for abortion, although in this case we refer to them as period pills. And then at the end of the day, we're not pregnant. And we have come an enormous a distance in the last 5 years in terms of being able to make this option available in the United States. And there's still a huge distance to cover in terms of folks who might be pregnant having any idea that this option exists, right? And that they can obtain pills and use them in this way. And then there's a whole question, right, about whether or not we can use this as one practical solution in places where abortion is either banned or restricted very early, like at 6 weeks after your last menstrual period.
Can you tell me under what insurance code people will get this?
So I would say that 5 years ago, the goal was to see if we could discover through research whether or not patients were interested in this option, right? And could we launch a pilot project in California to provide period pills? And at the end of the 5 years, instead, we're in a place where period pills are available through telehealth in all 50 states and territories. Right? So we've got some clinical guidelines changing, and we have at least 3 studies that show very clearly that people who might be pregnant are interested in having this option available to them. One of the next steps to really pursue is how we get insurance to cover this. So right now, it's mostly clinicians who are offering pills for medication abortion who are also offering period pills. We would certainly like in the future for that to become a much broader group of folks who offer these pills to their patients. So for the most part, they are billing them either under an office visit or under a medication abortion if the way that is described in insurance codes doesn't require a positive pregnancy test. What's been fascinating and what's moved this forward so quickly, right, is not only the rapid expansion of telehealth because of the pandemic, but also a shift in protocols around the way medication abortion is done in the US because of the pandemic. You can make somebody come in and have a urine pregnancy test in the clinic because nobody wanted anybody to come into clinics anywhere, right? And the silver lining of that period is that we have this great US research, which reinforces what we know from countries all over the world, right? That you don't need to have a pregnancy test at all to use period pills. One of the things that means is that requirement to show that a pregnancy exists using a test or ultrasound has sort of gone by the wayside. You can just say, yes, somebody's pregnant. I gave them pills. Check.
Is there any other indication under which someone can get period pills through telehealth? And the reason I'm getting at this is because we're talking about the practicalities of giving people more control over their bodies again, right? There are going to be people who maybe, I hope, listen to this podcast and think, oh, I want to tell my daughters about this. But without a pregnancy test and with the fear that a lot of young women feel around even talking about whether they might or might not be pregnant, is there any other indication under which they can get the pill?
Well, so I would say this. Here are the indications for which you can get either misoprostol or in combination with this other drug, which is the one we talk about most in the US called mifepristone. Mifepristone makes misoprostol work better, right?
Mm.
So it works faster and it is less uncomfortable. That's great, right? It isn't necessarily needed, but it does make things work better. So you can get these pills, these 2 kinds of pills, for a number of reasons. First, you can get them in advance, right? If you go to planc.org, Plan C is a wonderful referral site for pills. It has pills listed for every state in the country, all sorts of online providers. But you can go to telehealth clinics with clinicians. You can order pills in advance and have them on hand for either period pills or as medication abortion pills if you wait longer, or if you're having a miscarriage to manage your miscarriage. If you reach out to a telehealth provider and you say, I am cramping and bleeding, I am having a miscarriage, right? They can also send you pills to complete the miscarriage and manage it safely. So those are really the 4 indications. There are, yeah.
I'm thinking about mothers who had control over their own bodies now sending their daughters to college in a state where their daughter has less control over her own body than we did 25 years ago. And that's
Yeah.
horrifying to me. And I'm thinking, as a mom, what would I do?
I think it is a really important option.
Mm-hmm.
And it is important that people know that it exists and it's becoming more and more common for providers to be willing to let you have pills in advance in case you need them, right? Now, just to be clear, right, because this is my legal background speaking, it may not be legal, right, for your daughter to possess them at the college she's at if she's in a red state, right? But in general, in at least 49 states, and the 51's a little blurry, it is not illegal to self-manage an abortion, right? So,
It's also not
it,
illegal for the mom to have those pills at her house in the blue state.
oh,
And for the
100%.
girl to call and say, Mama, code red, coming home this weekend.
Yeah, and to be able to tell the daughter, that you've got them on hand if any of her friends need them, right? Because I think we remember from those days
Mhm.
that it's often very difficult for women to tell parents or folks outside of their tight circles of friends what might be happening and what they need. Um, and I think, when we back in the old days, when we were in college, thinking about rape and sexual assault, that is certainly a great model to think about in terms of community resourced abortion. And one of the things I love about working with young activists is that so many of them right now are engaged in building these community support networks where somebody within the circle of friends, within the broader community, has pills on hand to help somebody else.
It's beautiful, right? Because women have been taking
Yeah.
care of each other in this way for centuries.
And at least right now, it is very, very easy to find good sources of those medications online that are inexpensive. The MAP, which is a telemedicine provider, all physicians out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, for instance, they charge $5 and up for medication abortion pills.
What are the misconceptions that people have around using these medications?
That they're unsafe, right? That's the first misconception. And unfortunately, folks who oppose abortion have this one very small, now discredited study, I think from Sweden or Norway, that showed an increase of ER visits, right, among folks who used pills versus folks who were in clinics. Again, it has been thoroughly debunked. It was retracted from journals. That has not stopped folks from quoting it, especially in legal proceedings, as a reason to ban abortion pills or restrict them. I think the other misconception is that abortion pills are the same as emergency contraception or Plan B. Well, like, no, these are very
Plan
different
B
things.
is not the same thing, right?
Right. Plan B will keep you from ovulating. It may or may not keep a fertilized egg from implanting into the uterus, right? But probably rarely. Once you're pregnant, Plan B does not do anything, right? You can take a whole bunch of Plan B and you're still going to be pregnant the next day. These other pills that we're talking about, right, that we use for period pills, abortion, and miscarriage, they are not the same as emergency contraception. And I think even for folks who spend a lot of time thinking about reproductive rights, right, and who feel really firmly pro-choice, like that can be very confused for them. Those are probably the two biggest misunderstandings about what the pills are and how they work. The law is really tough right now, right? It's going to be tougher the next 4 years. So we have a number of states where abortion is banned completely. Right? We have 2 or 3 states where, in addition to abortion bans, folks are trying to implement incredibly punitive regimes around abortion and pregnancy. And those are really Louisiana, Texas, and Idaho. It is clear to me they are all willing to tolerate large numbers of maternal deaths in order to be ideologically consistent and pure. And that is really like rather unusual comparatively when we talk about abortion, right? Like abortion bans are a spectrum, right? You can have abortion bans that come with a police state where folks are monitoring whether or not factory girls are getting their periods on time, right? And you threaten to put women in jail if they have abortions as well as their providers. And then you actually follow up and you do put women in jail, right? And you let pregnant women die regularly in order to not have any involvement in ending the possible life of a fetus, even when you know it will die anyway. So that's one end. The other end of the spectrum is when abortion is nominally illegal, right? And then the country goes to great lengths to make pregnancy safe and to make sure there are other options so that women don't die from unsafe abortion. And Bangladesh is a great example of this, right? Bangladesh is a really conservative country. It is a poor country. Abortion is illegal. However, menstrual regulation is legal up until 10 weeks after a woman's last menstrual cycle, right? Same procedure as abortion, same pills as abortion, but you never confirm a pregnancy. And that gray area is what makes it work. It's promoted in government clinics, right? So there are really a lot of choices here.
Mhm.
And where we end up in this country, right, especially in red and purple states, is very much a question mark.
Mhm.
So as I mentioned, there are 3 states, right, where we're seeing moves to make the regime as punitive as possible. So Texas, came up with this idea of having essentially abortion bounty hunters, where your friends and neighbors can bring you into court and sue you if they think you had an abortion. And if they're right, they get a $10,000 reward. It's wild. Right.
It's
There
hard. No,
hasn't
no.
been a successful case yet, right? But there, behind that, right, you can see this real urge to punish, right? To punish people and to make them scared. Louisiana, and you've probably read about this, has just decided that mifepristone and misoprostol should be classified as controlled substances, like narcotics, right? And so you've had labor and delivery wards in Louisiana running these emergency drills because now they have to lock up their misoprostol. It's really important for postpartum hemorrhage. And it turns out when somebody starts bleeding out after labor and delivery, it happens so fast, right? Like,
How long does a doctor have to administer the misoprostol in the case of a postpartum hemorrhage?
right, or oh, right. So it's misoprostol or oxytocin. I am told, and again, I am not a clinician, that minutes is what you're talking about, like a window of 5 to 7 minutes to stop this before someone potentially bleeds too much. Right?
Now the
Um,
medication is on lockdown, and who knows who has the key, and it's on the other side of the hospital, and then the woman dies.
um, and so I often want to have good faith in our friends and neighbors, right? That they really care about babies, right? And that they come to the table with the same theology I was raised with, right? Which is that babies are good and pure and they haven't sinned yet. And women are fallen and responsible for all the sin in the world. And especially if we've had sex, well, then we're really dirty and bad. So obviously, if you're going to choose one to save, you choose the baby over the bad woman, right? But I want to believe people are still coming to this with good hearts. And then I look at something like the state of Louisiana, and that state will let so many poor Black women die when they're pregnant, just writ large, right? That is one place where it's very difficult to have any faith that we can find even these workaround policies where we're at least protecting pregnant women who are having complications, right? And not making them die for the sake of ideological purity.
Why is it so medically dangerous to classify these drugs as narcotics?
Right?
Because women who didn't even want an abortion will die.
Women who just had a baby,
Who
right?
just had one.
Women who want to raise their babies, right? Because they just had a brand new baby will die because you've made one of these drugs a controlled substance.
So now it's not just dangerous to be raped in one of these states in Louisiana. It's not just dangerous to need an abortion in Louisiana. It's dangerous to have a baby in Louisiana.
Yeah, and in Louisiana, that's been true for a long time, but now it is more dangerous, right? And now it is more dangerous in states where the entire medical system is not already quite so biased against women, right? It is far more dangerous in Missouri, in Iowa, in South Dakota to be pregnant than it was before because you can be suffering, right, an emergent complication, and people are terrified to treat you because they're afraid they will go to jail. So, so one option, right? Can you make abortion legal again in this state? If so, go for it. Absolutely. But, someone who grew up in South Dakota, pictures of South Dakota behind me. It is definitely one of my homes. South Dakota just failed to pass an initiative that would bring back abortion rights in any form. In states like that, there are still ways that we can potentially come at this from the side and say, okay, you cannot choose to end a pregnancy in this state. But what we have to do is carve out some space so that if you're pregnant and you start to have problems, right, doctors aren't going to refer you to the parking lot where you can bleed out and die because they're afraid they're going to go to jail. Right? And I do hope that there are ways that we can build policies to make pregnancy care safer again, both because that will reduce maternal mortality that we've already seen spike, right, in these states with abortion bans in wanted pregnancies, but it's also because it makes the self-managed abortion even safer, right? We're so far past this world where people were using coat hangers, and that is fantastic, right? Pills are safe. And sometimes people need follow-up care, right? And you can, in fact, make this more complicated if you make it terrifying for doctors and other clinicians to provide pregnancy care. But if you make the space, right, to be able to treat pregnant women appropriately when they have complications, you're also creating more space for folks who've had abortions to have safe care. And again, it is a strange time and place, right, when the scenario you have is, here's a 15-year-old. She may have done something you really disapprove of, right? She may have gone to Minnesota to have her abortion. Like, is the answer really that, again, that you want her to bleed out in the parking lot? Like, even if you hate abortion, what is done, right? Like, for the love of all that is good and holy, let's at least provide follow-up care safely, right? And make it clear that we're not going to put doctors in jail for keeping pregnant women alive or treating their
And
miscarriages.
take it the next step. If you really are so deeply opposed to any kind of abortion, can we just talk about miscarriage? Can we just talk about miscarriage management? Because it's so charged, this conversation, for anyone who might listen to this who is anti-choice. Do you believe that miscarriage should equal death? Because if you don't, then there's gray area you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, miscarriage and ectopics as well, right? When
And
you've got
ectopics.
an embryo developing outside of the uterus that threatens the life of a person, because that's the other scenario that we've seen recently really give people hiccups to the extent that they don't want to have those women in their emergency departments or or their clinics or their hospitals. But of course that essentially means that you're increasing their risk of dying, because an ectopic is like an infected appendix, right? It can burst at any time and threaten the life of the person who's carrying it. And you're absolutely right, Poonam, right? Miscarriages are awful. They're super hard. They're super unpleasant for almost anyone who has had one. And the idea that you're going to make clinicians scared then to provide help to folks who are already having this incredibly difficult personal and health experience, right? And potentially raise the risk that they will have morbidity such that they can't carry pregnancies in the future, or that they will bleed out or get a terrible infection and die. Like, that part is just unconscionable, no matter what people think about intervening in the development of an embryo or zygote, right? Like, it just,
Exactly.
that is one of the places where I think we can really build strong coalitions, even in conservative states, and create more safe space for doctors. That work gets much more difficult if you have a misogynistic federal administration that really does want to control and punish women. And again, like, I find it so hard to talk this way, in that, like, I always want to show good faith for other people's motivations and intentions. And I do not like conceptualizing things as a fight, right? Like, I want to build things. I want to know how we build a better future together. How can we work together? Where is our common ground?
You're
But
starting from compassion. Not everybody is. And sometimes admitting that hurts.
it's hard. I keep telling my boys we are going to do our best the next 4 years to speak the truth and protect the vulnerable. every way we can. And
What are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful that the American public, when faced with the reality of their previous views about abortion rights, switched tack immediately. I think that makes me so hopeful that when people were faced with what it would actually mean to make abortion illegal again and inaccessible, and especially what happens to pregnant women with wanted pregnancies when you do that in a punitive way, that public opinion shifted essentially overnight, right?
It
And that
restores some
there
trust.
are
Hmm.
yeah, and that there are strong majorities almost everywhere in this country that support either essentially unfettered abortion rights or fairly wide abortion rights. That won't get us to abortion rights in deep red states. Like, they're just too gerrymandered, their judiciaries are too conservative, and it's too easy to still sway public opinion in like the way that South Dakota just did and convince them, that you gonna allow, oh, sorry, here's the habit, this post-birth abortion nonsense, right?
I mean, I can't even with that phrase. I can't even with the
Right.
phrase.
Well, and especially when you know what they're talking about, right? Because
What are
they're
they
talking
talking
about,
about?
right. So they will frame this, the folks who put together these born alive infant protection acts, as, some dastardly late abortion gone wrong where a baby is delivered and is fighting for its life, and folks are going to, end it. Which, to be clear, right, does not happen.
Right.
Not,
And which, to be clear, is murder.
right, in
It's
every
just
state,
actually taking someone who's alive and then doing the
right,
murdering,
and
which is
infanticide.
not what anybody ever said when we talked about abortion.
Right, but what they do in these bills, when they talk about these post-birth, abortions or deaths, is they take people in truly the most tragic circumstances that I can imagine as a person who's been pregnant, right? Like, I had friends who had a baby born maybe 5 years ago, about 30 weeks, they had induced, because it turned out that this baby did not have lungs. She gives birth to this baby girl who lives for several hours. She has like this much of one lung, and they're able to hold her and sing to her and comfort her until she passes. And it is still the most tragic thing they have ever gone through, right? Like, of course it is. And these bills would force them instead to give this baby that is going to die every possible medical intervention to try to keep it alive.
To torture it,
Right. Like, can you even imagine as a mother, right? And all you want to do is the most merciful thing you can. And I,
which is
I think
hold your
that's the
baby for the
piece,
hours that she has.
right? That's the piece that I find so unconscionable,
Yeah.
right? You're talking about babies that are essentially getting hospice care because they can't live. And whatever you think your God requires you to do in that situation, okay, but like, you're gonna, oh,
You're
yeah,
gonna
that one
torture
really,
the entire family
yeah, it really burns me. And
just to
and
say,
and to say then that, like, the doctors and nurses and, maternal fetal medicine specialists who are helping these grieving families, that they're murderers. Oh,
yeah.
it's just, yeah, unconscionable is the only word I have for that one. That one is really dark.
So it seems like the conclusion is, what can we do? And the only thing we can do is educate, because we know so many women and girls don't understand anything about period management as something they need to be aware of along the
Right.
lines of abortion and before abortion and for miscarriage and just for
Yeah,
their overall health. That's one thing. But the other thing is, people need to be educated on the actual impact of these laws,
that's
because
right.
they may
Yeah.
be voting for things
I
not knowing
think
what it means.
I think so many people who believe that their God wants them to protect babies do have really good intentions, right? And don't want these dystopian outcomes. And that gives me a lot of hope that as they continue to be publicized, at the very least, we can come together in coalition to protect pregnancy care. And I would say that, yes, you are absolutely right. Education is huge, right? If you have any listeners who do giant ad campaigns in New York or like are involved in media in Hollywood, by all means, contact We would love to have your expertise on how we can educate women and girls across the country. But there, also practically what people have done since Dobbs, and I would continue to encourage them to do, is to give to abortion funds, right? They help women and girls get out of conservative states and get treatment. And those are especially the folks who are not going to be well served by pills. Pills work great for almost everybody. They don't work particularly well if you're 20 weeks pregnant and you've just found out you have a baby that isn't going to live or is going to live in so much pain and suffering. And then the abortion funds are so important because they really provide all the practical support to folks. And as someone who works closely with them, these are places that are held together with scotch tape and love, right? And then I think what you said, Poonam, is 100%. Like, you can get pills in advance. They are not expensive. And by all means, like, empower yourselves, your daughters, other people, right? Get pills, read about how to use pills, whether you use them to bring down your period or to have an abortion. If this becomes ubiquitous, right, that people just assume that along with things like Advil and Tylenol, oh, and probably those 4 emergency Vicodin from that time when you broke your leg that you keep on hand just in case, right, that you also have abortion pills around. I think this becomes much harder to enforce as a police state, even in the darkest areas of this country where people want to.
A network, almost like an underground railroad of people who have pills.
They do exist. So red state access is probably the best well known. I actually have not checked. I assume they take donations, and especially, small scale from individuals, but those are like your community members giving you pills for free off of the internet and also holding your hand while you use them. So
Red,
practical support networks like Red State Access are fantastic and they are doing great work.
that's what we needed to know. Um, what would you be doing if you weren't doing this?
Oh, I would be back on the Thai-Burma border teaching critical thinking skills and current events to migrant teenagers.
What is your biggest regret in this work so far, personally?
Biggest regret? That's a good question. I wonder if I can answer by saying the biggest lesson learned, which is that when I was younger, I needed it to be okay with other people that I had different ideas. And I wanted it to be other folks are convinced that the only solution to this, right, is to have abortion legal, free, on demand at any time up until 40 weeks. Like, that is their path. And I have my path. And there was a time when I needed other folks to tell me that my path was okay. And now I do not. And I think that is a real benefit of age, right?
It's sort of the business of growing up. The beauty of this age that we are at now is waking up to, I kind of always knew who I was, kind of always knew what mattered, I kind of always knew what I cared about. And I'm just going to do it more calmly and maybe sometimes more loudly now.
Yeah. I was raised very Christian and sort of all over the Christian, from Calvinism to being confirmed Lutheran and going to Catholic school. And so I try to pull threads, right, from all of these different traditions that I can see in a positive light. And one of my favorite things from having been in the Lutheran church for a long time is that Luther always says to sin boldly, right? Which means like to own your choices, right? And if somebody thinks you're sinning, well, like, if you're sure, do it boldly, right? Own it. And yes, I think that is a real benefit of coming into ourselves and growing older, right? The increased comfort in being who we are, even if some of those choices are controversial or other people don't approve.
And wouldn't Henrietta be so
Henrietta,
proud of
yeah.
you for sinning
You know,
boldly?
maybe, right? Or maybe she just really wanted a baby. Who knows, right? Like, who can say? But wouldn't it be nice if she lived in a time and place where she got to choose what happened to her after whatever bad thing did? I have no idea what she would have grown up like, but it would have been really great if she'd had the chance to grow up.
Well, I get that you're always open to the caveat and you're always going out of your way not to make the assumptions about people. But you can't stop me from believing that she is proud of you because you are, I guess, sinning really boldly.
Well, maybe your great aunt can be proud of me. How about that?
Oh, my great aunt's super proud of you. She loves us both. She's riding sidecar.
I love that.